South Africa is a diverse nation with a history of racial injustice. From 1948 until 1989, the country's white minority government kept people of different races separated by a system called apartheid. A young lawyer named Nelson Mandela and members of the African National Congress fought against apartheid and the South African government's oppression of black South Africans, largely through nonviolent protest. Instead of arming themselves, Mandela and other members of the African National Congress organized workers' strikes and marches. They encouraged black South Africans to take part in acts of civil disobedience. Intended as peaceful demonstrations, they often became scenes of violence, especially when South African police tried to remove the protesters. Hoping to stop the marches, the government outlawed the African National Congress and began imprisoning its leaders. The conflict only worsened.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and nonviolence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
In 1964, Nelson Mandela was arrested, tried, and condemned to life in prison for conspiracy to commit terrorist acts. He was sent to Robben Island prison, where guards beat and tortured their prisoners. Despite being in prison, Mandela and other African National Congress members continued their protest. Prisoners staged hunger strikes and work slowdowns. Their dream of freedom and equality never died. While Mandela and other African National Congress leaders protested in prison, young people continued to protest on the streets. The government considered each demonstration, each rock they threw, each class they missed, a crime against the state. Thousands of people were killed in confrontations with the South African police and military. Their deaths brought world attention to the horrors of apartheid. But government forces did not commit all the killings. A political feud between the African National Congress and its rival, the Inkatha Freedom Party, resulted in black-on-black violence. The feud resulted in the deaths of some 15,000 people in the 1980s and 90s. In the late 1980s, protests for the release of Nelson Mandela and the end of apartheid intensified. Still, the government chose to ignore the protesters. The escalation of violence led the government to order a state of emergency, which permitted policemen to use violence in confrontations with the African National Congress. But international awareness of the deadly struggle finally put pressure on the South African government. The United States, along with many other countries, imposed strict economic sanctions on South Africa. Foreign boycotts hurt the country's economy. Both blacks and whites suffered from South Africa's economic downturn. International outrage and economic pressure finally forced South Africa's white leadership to abandon apartheid. In 1989, the South African government officially ended apartheid and lifted the ban on the African National Congress. Soon after that, Nelson Mandela was released, ending 27 years of imprisonment. In 1994, the country held its first multiracial election and elected Nelson Mandela as its first black president. South Africa established a democratic government. It adopted a constitution that included a Bill of Rights. The end of apartheid has opened up many opportunities for black South Africans. For the first time in 300 years, black South Africans have political power. They are free to move, work, and live wherever they choose. But for many, quality of life has not improved. President Nelson Mandela promised jobs, better housing, and better schools for all South Africans. But despite his promise, more than 1/3 of black South Africans continue to live at or below the poverty line. And poverty is not the only thing that black South Africans must cope with. The memories of apartheid are difficult to forget. and even harder to forgive. It has been difficult for South Africans to erase the impact of their past. Even today, unemployment, crime, and a wide gap between rich and poor continue to threaten South Africa's democracy. But even with all of its problems, South Africa's long struggle against apartheid has brought the country many successes. Nelson Mandela gave South Africans a fresh start and the opportunity to live as free people. Only time will tell if new opportunities will bring success to all South Africans.
This, the year of liberation for all South Africans, we have thus characterized the year 1994 to express the deep-seated hope of all our people that this year all of us will at last achieve our emancipation. This year, a new birth will occur.
He's probably the one leader in the world whose morality and leadership is completely unquestioned. In a context where you find that the whole world is sort of in some state of upheaval and change, South Africa is the one country where that change is very positive. And a lot of that change is symbolized through Nelson Mandela.
Sifuna imali eyaneleyo yokubana silungise zonke ezi zinto kuba sifuna abantwana bethu baye esikolweni bafunde mahala. Umzala ngamnye xa ngamsanga umntana wakhe esikolweni afakwe ityala.
He went to school at the age of about 7. His father realized that his son had a vision and a dream from an early age to help and lead his people. He asked the Tembu chief, Jongintaba Dalinjebu, on his deathbed to take care of his son and give him an education. Since then, education always played a most important role in Madiba's life. Even on Robben Island, he kept studying and inspired those around him to do so. After he was freed, long before he became president, he started working tirelessly to improve the quality of education for all in the country.
Education is one of the most important weapons in a country, and the extent to which black education is neglected is something very difficult to put in words. We wanted to transform education into a national asset, into an instrument we can use for development.
He asked young South Africans to help him in building a new South Africa.
You are going to remain in the country rather than to take away technology and skills away to serve other countries and other communities. We really need people who have had the opportunities to remain in this country and to serve our people.
Madiba believed that investing in education meant investing in a prosperous future. His vision inspired major companies to answer to his call for partnerships to tackle education challenges in the country.